The scout ship Windrider moved slowly through a patch of dead space that no one had bothered to map for 300 years. The pilot, a Ythran named Sail, was bored. Most of the Ythran fleet thought the same. Their job was simple: fly to empty places, take readings, and go home. Nobody expected to find anything out here. This part of space was called the Long Silence by the older star charts, because nothing lived here, nothing moved here, and no ships ever came here. Sael leaned back in his seat and let the ship's computer do the work. The Ythrans were a curious species, tall and thin, with large eyes built for reading starlight, and long fingers built for fine instruments. They were not warriors. They were explorers, traders, and map-makers. Their fleet was small compared to the great powers of the galaxy, but their scouts went everywhere, because nobody feared the Ythrans enough to stop them from looking. That was why the Windrider was here, drifting past a lonely red star with no name, checking a dust cloud that the old charts marked as empty. It was not empty. "Sael," said the ship's computer, "I am reading a large metal structure ahead. It is not on any record." Sael sat up. "Define large." "Larger than any station I have seen. Larger, I believe, than any station on record in the Concord database." The Concord was the great alliance of 900 worlds, the loose government that most of the galaxy's peoples belonged to. If something was not in the Concord database, it meant either it was very old, very hidden, or very new. Sael did not think it could be very old, because the dust cloud they were passing through was young, formed only in the last few thousand years by the slow death of a nearby star. Nothing ancient could hide inside dust that young. That left hidden or new. "Bring us closer," Sael said, slowly. "Passive sensors only." The Windrider crept forward. The dust thinned as they went deeper, and through the haze, shapes began to form. First there were faint lights, dozens of them, then hundreds. Then the shapes themselves became clear, and Sael felt his hearts, Ythran's had too, begin to beat faster. It was not a station. It was a shipyard, and it was enormous. Long metal arms stretched out for kilometers, holding half-built hulls in their grip like a mother holding a child. Sael counted the shapes as fast as he could, but he lost count after 30. There were small ships, fast ones, the kind built for scouting and quick strikes. There were bigger shapes too, hulls so large that Sael's mind struggled to understand their size, warships that dwarfed anything the Concord Navy had ever built. And around all of it, quiet and dark, drifted a ring of smaller machines. Sael's sensors read them as automated defense platforms, thousands of them. "Computer," Sael said slowly, "who owns this place?" The computer took a moment to answer. "Scanning hull markings. I have found a match." A single word appeared on the screen, a word Sael recognized, because everyone in the galaxy knew it, though not everyone respected it. Humanity. Sael stared at the screen for a long moment. Humans, the weak ones, the workers, the species that had lost a war 200 years ago, and had spent every year since then bowing to whoever asked them to bow. Humans built cargo haulers and mining rigs. Humans served on other species' ships as engineers and laborers. Humans smiled and nodded and did what they were told, because everyone knew what happened to the ones who did not. There was no way humans had built this. "Run it again," Sael said. "I have run it 3 times, the computer said. The hull markings match the human alphabet with 99% confidence. The construction technique matches known human industrial patterns, though scaled far beyond anything humans have shown before." Sael's hands were shaking slightly as he reached for the communication panel. This was too big for a scout ship to handle alone. This was something the whole Concord needed to know about. But before he could send the message, a new light appeared on his screen. Something in the shipyard had noticed them. "Sael," the computer said, its voice suddenly urgent. "An object has detached from the main structure. It is moving toward us. Speed is..." The computer paused. "Speed is very high." Sael's blood went cold. "How high?" "Faster than anything in the Concord registry." The object closed the distance in seconds, not minutes. It was small, no bigger than a fighter craft, but it moved with a grace that made Sael's stomach twist. It stopped exactly 1 kilometer from the Windrider, close enough to be a clear threat, far enough to not seem like an attack. A small, precise, controlled move, not the move of a panicked or desperate people. A voice came through on an open channel, calm and clear, speaking the trade language that most of the galaxy used. Ythran vessel, you are in restricted space. Please identify yourself and state your purpose. Sael swallowed. This is Scout Ship Windrider, registered to the Ythran Exploration Guild. We were surveying this sector under Standard Concord Charter. We did not know this space was restricted. There was a pause. Understood. This space belongs to the Human Sovereign Zone. It is not listed on Concord charts because it is not part of Concord territory. Sael frowned. All human territory is part of the Concord. Humanity signed the Second Accord 200 years ago. Humanity's homeworld and colonies are part of the Concord, the voice replied. This system is not a colony. It was never declared, and under the Second Accord, humanity retained the right to unclaimed space discovered and developed independently, so long as it posed no threat to Concord members. This system falls under that clause. Sael did not know what to say to that. He had never heard of such a clause, but he was not a lawyer, and this was not the time to argue treaty law with an armed ship. What is this place? Sael asked, before he could stop himself. Another pause, longer this time. That is not information we are required to share with a scout vessel. You will be escorted to the edge of the system. Please power down all active scanning and follow the guide beacon. Sael's sensors picked up more ships now, quiet, unlit vessels that had been hiding in the dust the whole time, dozens of them forming a loose ring around the Windrider. He had walked into a trap without even knowing it, and only now did he see how thoroughly he had been watched from the moment he entered the cloud. Understood, Sael said quietly, and he powered down his sensors. The guide beacon led them out slowly, back through the dust, back toward open space. Sael watched his instruments the whole way, memorizing everything he could, every shape, every light, every number his passive sensors managed to catch before they were switched off. It was not much, but it was enough to know one thing for certain. Whatever this place was, it had not been built to sit quietly and mine rocks. Sael had counted enough hulls, enough weapons ports, enough armor plating, to know a war fleet when he saw one, and this was bigger than any war fleet the Concord had ever assembled, bigger than anything any single species had built in living memory. When the Windrider finally cleared the dust cloud, and the guide beacon blinked out, Sael sat in silence for a long time. Then he opened a channel to Ythran Guild Command, and his voice shook as he spoke. This is Scout Ship Windrider, requesting immediate priority contact with Guild Command and Concord Council Liaison. I have urgent information. I repeat, urgent information. Humanity is hiding something in the long silence, and it is not a colony. 6 days later, the report reached the Concord Council chamber on Thren Station, the great meeting hall built at the center of Concord space, where representatives from all 900 member worlds gathered to argue, vote, and occasionally agree on something. The chamber went silent as the images from the Windrider's sensors played on the main screen, hull after hull, weapon port after weapon port. The council members, used to years of routine trade disputes and border arguments, stared at the screen with expressions ranging from confusion to open fear. At the human delegations table, Ambassador Elena Voss sat very still. She had known this day would come eventually. She had hoped it would come later, when the fleet was closer to finished, when humanity would have more ships ready to answer whatever came next. But hope was not a plan, and Elena Voss had spent her whole career making plans for days exactly like this one. The Korvath delegate, a broad, heavy being named Draeth Kool, rose from his seat, his voice booming through the chamber. Ambassador Voss, he said, and every eye in the room turned to her. Perhaps you would care to explain why your people have been secretly building a war fleet, larger than the entire Concord Navy, in violation of every principle of trust this alliance was built upon. Elena Voss stood slowly. She had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times in her mind, though never quite like this. Never with the whole galaxy watching. She looked around the chamber, at all the faces waiting for her answer, some curious, some afraid, some already hungry for a reason to strike first. I will answer that question, she said, her voice steady and calm. But first, I think it is only fair that this council remembers exactly why my people learned, 200 years ago, that trust alone was never going to be enough to keep us safe. The chamber went quiet again. And this time, the silence had a different weight to it. Because everyone in that room, human and alien alike, remembered the war that had ended with Earth burning and humanity begging for peace. And everyone in that room was about to learn that humanity had never truly stopped preparing for the day it might happen again. Ambassador Elena Voss let the silence sit for a moment before she spoke again. She was not a tall woman, and she did not have the booming voice of a Korvath or the sharp presence of some of the other delegates in the room. But she had spent 30 years in this chamber, and she knew how to make people listen. 211 years ago, she said, humanity made first contact with the Korvath Dominion. We were a young species then. We had only just begun to travel beyond our own solar system. We had colonies on 3 worlds and a fleet of ships built mostly for exploration and trade. We were not ready for what came next. She gestured, and the screen behind her changed. It showed old images, grainy and faded, of Earth as it had looked from orbit 2 centuries ago, blue and green and whole. The Korvath Dominion decided that humanity's territory would make a useful buffer zone against a rival empire. They did not ask us. They did not negotiate. They arrived at our colony on Rhea Station with a fleet of 80 warships and gave us 1 hour to surrender the system. The image changed again. This time it showed the aftermath. Elena did not need to say much about this image. It spoke for itself. We refused. We had children on that station, and we did not believe any civilized power would fire on a station full of children. We were wrong. Rhea Station was destroyed in 11 minutes. 40,000 people died, including my own grandmother, who I never had the chance to meet. A few of the delegates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The Korvath delegate, Draeth Kul, said nothing, though his jaw was tight. The war lasted 6 more years, Elena continued. By the end of it, Earth itself had been bombed twice. 3 of our colonies were gone completely. Our fleet, what remained of it, numbered less than 40 ships. We surrendered because we had no other choice. The Korvath Dominion took what they wanted from our systems and left us with just enough to survive and just enough shame to keep us quiet. She paused, letting that settle. 10 years after the war ended, the Concord was formed, and humanity was invited to join. We were told this alliance would protect its members from exactly the kind of aggression we had suffered. We were told that as long as we followed the rules, no one would ever again arrive at our door with warships and an ultimatum. Elena looked slowly around the chamber, meeting the eyes of delegate after delegate. We wanted to believe that, truly we did, but my people had learned a hard lesson, and it was this. Promises are easy to make and easy to break, and the only thing that reliably stops a stronger power from taking what it wants is the cost of trying. So while humanity smiled and nodded and did the work no one else wanted to do, quietly, carefully, over 200 years, we also built something else. You built a weapon aimed at the Concord, Draeth Kul said, his voice low and dangerous. No, Elena said firmly. We built a shield. There is a difference, Delegate Kul, though I understand why from where you sit, the two might look the same. A murmur ran through the chamber. Another delegate, a slender being from the water world of Cassis, raised a translucent hand. Ambassador, if this fleet is truly meant only for defense, why hide it? Why not simply build it in the open, as every other Concord member does? Elena nodded, as if she had expected exactly this question. Because, Delegate, if we had built it in the open, someone would have destroyed it before it was finished. We were a weak species after the war. Anyone who saw us building a real fleet would have assumed we were preparing to break the peace, and they would have struck first, exactly as the Dominion struck Rhea Station, before we had the chance to explain ourselves. Hiding the fleet was the only way to make sure it survived long enough to matter. The chamber fell into an uneasy quiet. Elena could feel the room shifting, some delegates leaning toward sympathy, others toward suspicion, and a few, especially among the Korvath and their allies, leaning toward something closer to fear, turning into anger. Draeth Kul stood again. How many ships, he asked slowly, are in that shipyard? Elena hesitated only a moment before answering. There was no point lying now. The truth would come out one way or another, and a lie discovered later would do far more damage than an honest number spoken now. As of this council session, she said, the Sovereign Zone Shipyard has completed construction of 412 capital ships, with an additional 190 currently under construction. This does not include support craft, defense platforms, or automated systems. The chamber erupted. Delegates shouted over one another, some demanding immediate action, others calling for calm, the noise growing so loud that the council speaker, an old and tired-looking being named Orvan Thass, had to strike his gavel 3 times before order returned. 400 ships, Draethkul said, once the room had quieted enough for his voice to carry. That is more than the entire combined navy of every Concord member species. You expect us to believe this was built only for defense? I expect you to look at the numbers honestly, Elena replied. The Concord has 900 member worlds, Delegate Cool, spread across a dozen major species. 400 ships, even 400 large ships, would not be enough to conquer this alliance, and we know that as well as you do. What 400 ships is enough to do, however, is make certain that no single power, or even a small alliance of powers, could do to humanity again what the Korvath Dominion did 200 years ago. And if the Dominion, or anyone else, decides that a fleet of 400 human warships is itself a threat that must be removed before it grows larger, asked the Cassie's delegate quietly. Elena Voss looked at her, and for the first time, her calm expression cracked just slightly, showing the tiredness underneath. Then I suppose we will find out whether the Concord truly believes in peace, she said, or whether it only believes in peace for those too weak to defend themselves. Speaker Orvan Thass called for a recess before the room could descend further into chaos. As the delegates filed out, arguing in small clusters, Elena Voss remained in her seat, watching them go, and allowed herself, just for a moment, to close her eyes. She had known this speech would not end the matter. If anything, it had only opened the door to something far more dangerous. Somewhere out there, admirals and war councils across a dozen species were already calculating, already wondering whether it was safer to strike the shipyard now, while it still had a chance of being destroyed, or to wait and risk facing it at full strength later. Elena's communicator buzzed quietly. She glanced down and saw a message from Admiral Marcus Cole, the overseer of the Sovereign Zone shipyard itself, the man who had spent the last 15 years of his life making sure that 400 ships stood ready for a day humanity had hoped would never come. They know now. The message read, "How did the council take it?" Elena typed back with steady hands. "About as well as we expected. Some fear, some anger, a few, maybe, who understand. Draethkul is already talking like a man building a case for war." A reply came quickly. "Then we'd better make sure the yard is ready for visitors, because if the Korvath decide to send a fleet instead of a diplomat, we won't have much warning." Elena stared at the message for a long moment before answering. "How ready are we, really, Marcus? Honestly?" The reply took longer this time. "Honestly, ready enough to make anyone think twice. Not ready enough to win a war against the whole Concord if it comes to that. Let's hope it doesn't come to that." Elena closed her eyes again and thought of Reyes Station, of the grainy old images that still made her chest tighten every time she saw them, of the 40,000 names carved into the memorial wall back on Earth. Humanity had spent 200 years making sure that day never happened again. Now, in a single council session, that entire careful, quiet plan had been dragged into the light, and there was no telling anymore how the galaxy would choose to respond. Outside the chamber, in a private meeting room reserved for war councils, Draethkul was already speaking quietly with 3 other delegates, representatives of species who had old grudges, old fears, and old appetites for power. By the time the council reconvened, a new proposal would be waiting, one that had nothing to do with negotiation, and everything to do with a fleet, an ultimatum, and a decision about whether humanity's secret shipyard would be allowed to exist at all. 3 days after the council session, Draethkul stood before a smaller, quieter room than the Great Concord Chamber. This room held only 12 seats, and every seat was filled with someone who agreed with him, or who could be made to agree with him before the meeting ended. "The humans have broken faith with this alliance," Draethkul said, pacing slowly at the front of the room. "They signed the second accord promising transparency between member species regarding military development. They have violated that promise for 200 years, hiding a fleet larger than anything this galaxy has seen since the old empires fell." A delegate from the Pharaoh cluster, a species of armored insectoids named the Chiton Assembly, clicked his mandibles in agreement. 400 ships, perhaps more by now. If they finish that fleet, No Concord species will be able to stand against them alone. Exactly, Draethkul said. And humanity has already shown us, once, exactly what they think of weaker species who stand in their way. Do any of you believe they have forgotten what we did to them at Reyes Station? Do any of you believe a species that spent 200 years secretly rebuilding for revenge has anything but revenge on its mind? The room murmured its agreement, though one delegate, a quiet, older being from a small trading world called Ansel Prime, raised a hand. Delegate Cool, if I may. Humanity has served this Concord faithfully for 2 centuries. They have never once broken a trade agreement. They have never once used force against a Concord member. Perhaps their fleet is exactly what their ambassador claimed, a shield built from fear, not a sword built for conquest. Draethkul turned to face him slowly. And if you are wrong, if we wait and do nothing, and that fleet finishes construction, and then, one day, humanity decides the debts of the past are due, tell me, Ansel Prime, will your small, unarmed trading world survive that day? The old delegate said nothing, and Draethkul took his silence as answer enough. I propose this, Draethkul continued, turning back to the room. We assemble a combined fleet, drawn from every species willing to contribute ships, under a unified command. We do not attack without warning, for we are not the dominion of 200 years ago. We are not monsters. We will give humanity one final ultimatum. Open the Sovereign Zone shipyard to full Concord inspection, halt all further construction, and surrender no less than half of the completed fleet into Joint Concord Command, to be crewed and controlled by a mixed council of species, never by humans alone. And if they refuse? Asked the chitin delegate. Draethkul's expression did not change. Then we destroy the shipyard before it becomes something none of us can stop. Word of the gathering fleet reached the Sovereign Zone 12 days later, carried by quiet channels that Elena Voss had spent years cultivating, precisely for moments like this one. She read the report twice, before calling Admiral Marcus Cole directly. His face appeared on her screen, tired, but steady, the reflection of stars visible faintly behind him through the observation window of his command ship, the Endeavor. You've seen the numbers, Marcus said, not bothering with greetings. I've seen them, Elena replied. Draethkul has pulled together contributions from the Korvath, the Chitin Assembly, the Velk Trading Combine, and at least 6 smaller species who owe the Korvath enough favors that they didn't feel they could say no. Current estimate is somewhere between 350 and 400 ships, with more joining every day. Marcus exhaled slowly. That's close to parity with our completed fleet. Close, Elena agreed, not equal. And Marcus, their crews haven't trained together. 6 different species, 6 different command structures, 6 different ways of fighting, all being forced into one fleet under one flag in a matter of weeks. That's not a real navy. That's a mob with better ships than usual. A mob with 400 warships is still 400 warships, Marcus said. I don't care how disorganized they are. If that fleet reaches the Sovereign Zone and decides to open fire, a lot of people are going to die, on both sides. Elena was quiet for a moment. What's our status? Marcus pulled up a display on his end, and a moment later the same information appeared on Elena's screen. Rows of numbers, hull counts, readiness percentages, crew rosters. 412 capital ships complete and crewed, Marcus said. Another 190, in various stages of construction, of which maybe 60 could be rushed to combat readiness in the next 2 weeks, if we push the yard crews hard. Full defense platform network is online, and has been for years. Our advantage isn't numbers, Elena. It's that every ship in this fleet has trained together for years, under one command, one doctrine, one set of tactics. And it's that most of our tech is a generation ahead of anything the Concord has ever fielded, because we didn't have to compromise designs across a dozen different species, with a dozen different ideas about how a warship should work. So we can fight them, Elena said slowly. We can beat them, Marcus said, and there was no arrogance in his voice, only the flat certainty of a man who had run the numbers 1,000 times. But Elena, listen to me. Winning that fight would mean killing thousands of Concord sailors, from a dozen different species, in the opening battle of a war that would probably never really end. Even if we won today, we'd spend the next 50 years fighting a galaxy that decided humanity really was the monster they always feared we might become. Elena closed her eyes briefly. So what do we do? We make sure it never comes to a fight, Marcus said. But Elena, I need you to understand something. And I need you to understand it clearly. Because I think it's about to matter more than anything else in this entire crisis. Go on. We are not going to disarm, Marcus said. We are not going to hand over half our fleet to a joint command that would leave humanity defenseless again. I would rather die at Rhea's station a second time than watch my people go back to being helpless in front of the next Dominion that decides we're worth conquering. If Draeth Cool's ultimatum is surrender or die, then I need every voice in that council chamber to understand, clearly, before a single shot is fired, exactly what will happen if his fleet arrives here looking for a fight. Elena nodded slowly. I'll make sure they understand. There's something else, Marcus added. I think we should let them see the yard. Not everything, not the full weapons specifications, but enough. Let them see what 400 human warships actually look like up close, crewed and ready, sitting in formation. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do isn't hide your strength, it's show it clearly enough that nobody has to guess, and nobody has room to convince themselves it's smaller than it really is. Elena thought about that for a long moment. It was a risk. Showing the fleet's true strength might convince the doubters in the Concorde that humanity truly was too dangerous to allow, might harden exactly the fear Draeth Cole was already using to build his coalition. But it might also do the opposite. It might make cooler heads in that gathering fleet stop and ask themselves whether 400 human warships, built by a species that had never once broken its word to the Concorde, were really worth dying to destroy. Do it, Elena said finally. Send the images through neutral channels, something the Ansel Prime delegate and the other cautious voices can quietly share around the council. Let them see exactly what they'd be fighting, and let them decide for themselves if Draeth Cool's war is really one they want to join. 2 weeks later, the combined Concorde fleet gathered at the edge of the long silence, 380 ships strong, drawn from 8 different species, flying under a single banner for the first time in Concorde history. Draeth Cole stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Dominion's Reckoning. Watching the sensor display fill with the shapes of his allied fleet arranged around him. Transmission incoming from the human sovereign zone, his communications officer reported. It's addressed to you directly, Delegate Cool. Put it through, Draeth Cool said. Admiral Marcus Cole's face appeared on the main screen. Calm, steady, standing on the bridge of the Endeavor, with the vast shape of the shipyard visible through the window behind him. Delegate Cool, Marcus said, I understand you've brought quite a fleet to our door. I have brought a Concorde peacekeeping force, Draeth Cool replied evenly. You have 1 hour to accept the council's terms. Open the shipyard for full inspection, halt construction, and transfer command of half your fleet to Joint Concorde Control. Refuse, and we will consider the Sovereign Zone shipyard a direct threat to Concorde security, to be neutralized by whatever means necessary. Marcus was quiet for a moment, and behind him, on the Endeavor's main viewport, something began to change. Slowly, silently, the darkness beyond the shipyard began to fill with lights, hundreds of them, engines igniting one by one as ship after ship moved out of dock formation and into open battle lines. A wall of human steel, stretching farther than Draeth Cool's sensors could easily measure. I've relayed your terms to the human government, Marcus said, and I've been asked to give you an answer. But first, Delegate Cool, I think it's only fair you see exactly what you're asking us to surrender. Draeth Cole stared at the growing formation on his screen, and for the first time since he had begun building this coalition, a small, cold seed of doubt took root in his chest. The bridge of the Dominion's Reckoning had gone quiet. Every officer, every crew member, stood watching the main screen as the human fleet continued to form up, ship after ship sliding into position, until the display was so crowded with contacts that the tactical computer struggled to render them all clearly. Count, Draeth Cole said, his voice tighter than before. Still counting, sir, the tactical officer replied. Confirmed contacts now, at 390, still rising. Estimated total, factoring in the shipyard's own construction records intercepted earlier, approximately 410 capital ships. Draeth Cole's jaw tightened. 410 against his 380. Not an overwhelming difference, not on paper, But paper did not account for the fact that his fleet was a patchwork of 8 species who had never trained together, never fought together, and in some cases barely trusted each other. Paper did not account for the quiet reports drifting in from his own scanning officers, who kept using words like unfamiliar configuration and unknown weapon signature to describe ship after ship in the human formation. On the screen, Marcus Cole waited patiently, his expression calm, almost gentle, the expression of a man who had already made peace with whatever was about to happen. "Delegate Cole," Marcus said, "I want to be very clear about something, because I don't think anyone here wants a misunderstanding to cost thousands of lives today." "Speak," Dreyeth Cool said. "This fleet did not launch to attack you," Marcus said. "Every ship you see is holding position at the edge of the shipyard's defense perimeter. Not one of them has moved a single meter toward your formation. We are not here to start a war, Delegate Cool. We are here to show you exactly what a war would cost, in the hope that seeing it clearly will help you choose not to start one." "A fine speech," Dreyeth Cool said, though the edge in his voice had softened slightly. "But you have not answered the Council's terms." "No," Marcus agreed. "I haven't. Because I'm not authorized to answer for the human government, only to hold this position and make sure you understand what you'd be facing if this becomes a fight. But I have someone here who is authorized to answer you." The screen split, and Ambassador Elena Voss appeared beside Marcus's image, standing not on a warship, but in a small, plain room that Dreyeth Cool recognized from the news broadcasts as the human government's council hall on Earth itself. "Delegate Cool," Elena said, "I have spoken with the Concord Council, with representatives from every species in your coalition, and with our own government leadership, over the last 6 hours. I want to offer you something different than what you asked for. Not a surrender, a partnership." Dreyeth Cool frowned. "Explain." "You are afraid," Elena said, "that a fleet of 400 human warships, controlled only by humans, is a threat to every other species in this alliance. I understand that fear, Delegate Cool, because it is the same fear that has driven my people for 200 years, ever since your ancestors decided our colonies would make a convenient buffer zone." A murmur ran through the bridge crew at that, but Dreyeth Cool did not silence it. He only listened. "So here is what I propose," Elena continued. "Humanity will not surrender its fleet, and we will not stop construction of the ships already underway. But we will invite the Concord Council to establish a permanent joint oversight commission, with representatives from every major species, stationed here at the Sovereign Zone, with full access to fleet movements, construction records, and command communications. We will not hand you the keys to our ships, Delegate Cool, because a species that has been betrayed once does not easily hand over its only shield to the same alliance that let that betrayal happen. But we will let you watch, closely, honestly, for as long as it takes to rebuild the trust that should have existed between us from the very beginning." Dreyeth Cool was silent for a long moment, his eyes fixed on the screen, on the endless rows of human ships holding steady at the edge of the yard. "And if this council rejects your proposal," he asked finally, "if we decide the only acceptable outcome is exactly what was demanded, full surrender of half your fleet?" Marcus Cole answered this time, his voice quiet but absolutely certain. "Then, Delegate Cool, I would ask you to look very carefully at the ships behind me, and ask yourself honestly whether you believe your coalition, 380 ships that have never trained together, drawn from 8 species who barely agree on anything, can defeat 410 ships that have spent 15 years training as one fleet, built by engineers who never had to compromise their designs to satisfy a committee. I do not say this as a threat. I say this because I do not want a single sailor under your command to die today for a fight that ends the same way no matter how it starts." The bridge of the Dominion's reckoning was utterly silent now. Dreyeth Cool looked around at his own crew, at the tense, uncertain faces of officers who had signed on to enforce a Concord peacekeeping action, not to lead their species into a slaughter against an enemy fleet built for exactly this moment. "You ask me to trust you," Dreyeth Cool said finally, turning back to the screen, "after 200 years of hiding this fleet from us." "No," Elena said gently. "I ask you to verify us, Delegate Cool. Trust is not something you give away for free, not after what my people have survived. But verification, oversight, honest transparency. Going forward, starting today, that is something we can offer, and something I believe both our peoples need, if this alliance is going to survive what just happened here. Draith Cole turned away from the screen and walked slowly to the edge of the bridge, staring out through the great viewport at the distant lights of the human fleet. He thought of Reyes Station, of the images the ambassador had shown the council, of the 40,000 names that no Korvath history book ever mentioned, though every human seemed to know them by heart. He thought of his own homeworld, of what it would mean to bring 380 ships home in pieces, of the political chaos that would follow if his hastily assembled coalition shattered in the fire of a battle it was never truly ready to fight. And he thought, too, of what it would mean for the Korvath Dominion, and for every species watching this moment unfold, if humanity's answer to 200 years of quiet fear and preparation turned out to be an offer of partnership rather than an act of revenge. "Stand down the fleet," Draith Cole said quietly. His tactical officer turned, startled. "Sir?" "You heard me," Draith Cole said, louder now, enough for the whole bridge to hear. "Signal the coalition fleet. We are standing down. No weapons will be armed. No ship will advance beyond its current position." He turned back to the screen, meeting Elena Voss's steady gaze. "Ambassador, I will carry your proposal back to the Concord Council myself. I make no promises about what they will decide, but I will tell them what I saw here today, and I will tell them honestly." Elena inclined her head. "That is all I ask, Delegate Cole." Draith Cole studied her a moment longer, then glanced at Marcus Cole's calm, steady face on the screen beside her. "Tell me something, Admiral. If I had given the order to attack today, if I had not chosen to stand down, what would have happened?" Marcus considered the question carefully before answering. "Honestly, Delegate Cole, we would have won. It would not have been close, and it would not have been quick, and a great many people on both sides would not have lived to see the end of it. I am glad, more than I can easily say, that we do not have to find out for certain." Draith Cole nodded slowly, and for the first time since the crisis began, something like respect flickered behind his eyes. "So am I, Admiral," he said quietly. "So am I." Behind him, across the bridge, officers began relaying the stand-down order out to the assembled coalition fleet, and one by one, the aggressive formations that had gathered at the edge of the long silence began to loosen, weapons powering down, ships drifting back into looser, calmer patterns. Far across the divide, the human fleet held its position, steady and silent, neither advancing nor retreating, a wall that had never needed to move in order to make its point. It was not peace, not yet. It was only the absence, for now, of war. But as Elena Voss closed the channel and allowed herself, finally, to breathe, she understood that it was more than her people had dared to hope for when the Windrider had first stumbled into the long silence weeks before. The galaxy had found humanity's secret shipyard and had learned exactly what it had been built for. Now, for the first time in 200 years, humanity would find out whether the rest of the galaxy was ready to build something new alongside it, instead of against it. The Concord Council chamber on Thren Station was fuller than it had been in a generation. Word of the standoff at the long silence had spread across every member world within days, and now every delegate who could reach Thren Station in time had come to hear the outcome for themselves. Even delegates who rarely attended in person, preferring to send recordings or representatives, had made the journey. Everyone wanted to see history decided with their own eyes. Draith Cole stood at the podium first, and the chamber was silent as he spoke. He described what he had seen at the edge of the long silence, the endless lines of human warships, the calm, steady voice of Admiral Cole explaining exactly what a battle would cost, and the quiet, careful proposal offered by Ambassador Voss. "I went to that shipyard prepared for war," Draith Cole said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "I brought 380 ships, drawn from 8 species who had agreed, for the first time in Concord history, to fight side by side. I believed, honestly, that humanity's fleet was a threat that needed to be broken before it grew any larger. I was wrong about one part of that belief, and I want this council to understand clearly which part." He paused, looking around the chamber. "I was wrong to believe that fleet was built for conquest. I have reviewed every recording, every scan, every report from that day, and I have found nothing. Not one signal, not one maneuver, that suggested humanity intended to use that fleet against us. What I found instead was a species that had spent 200 years afraid, quietly building a shield in the dark because it did not trust this alliance to protect it, and I cannot entirely blame them for that fear, given what my own people did to earn it. A murmur ran through the chamber, and Draeth Cool let it settle before continuing. I was right, however, to believe that fleet is powerful enough to change the balance of this entire alliance. 410 ships, built by a species that has spent 2 centuries perfecting military technology in secret, is not a small thing, and this council would be foolish to pretend otherwise. The question before us now is not whether that fleet exists. It exists, and nothing we do today will change that. The question is whether we respond to its existence with fear and hostility, which I believe would only convince humanity that its 200 years of caution were entirely justified, or whether we respond with the partnership Ambassador Voss has offered us. He stepped back from the podium, and Speaker Orvan Thass called Elena Voss forward. Elena walked to the podium slowly, aware of every eye in the chamber following her. She thought, briefly, of the Windrider. Sal, whose curiosity had set this entire crisis into motion, and wondered if he had any idea what his discovery had led to. Delegates of the Concord, she began. 200 years ago, my people learned that trust, given freely and without protection, can be shattered in 11 minutes by anyone strong enough to decide it is worth breaking. We have spent every year since then making certain that lesson would never be repeated. I will not apologize for that. I do not think any species in this chamber, if they were honest with themselves, would have chosen differently in our position. She let that sink in before continuing. But I also understand, now more clearly than ever, that a shield built entirely in secret, no matter how carefully justified, looks very much like a sword to anyone who discovers it without warning. We should have found a better way to build our defense while still honoring the spirit of trust this alliance is supposed to represent. That failure is ours, and I take responsibility for it, on behalf of my government. What I propose today, Elena continued, is simple, though I do not pretend it will be easy. A permanent Concord Oversight Commission, seated at the Sovereign Zone Shipyard, with rotating representatives from every member species, granted full visibility into our fleet's status, our construction schedules, and our command structure. We will not surrender control of our ships, because a species that has been left defenseless once does not easily choose to be defenseless again. But we will open our doors, fully and honestly, so that no other species need ever again stumble upon our shipyard by accident and wonder, in fear, what we might be planning. She paused, looking out at the chamber. In exchange, I ask this council for one thing. I ask that the Second Accord be amended to formally recognize a member species' right to maintain an independent defense fleet, provided it operates under the same transparency I have just described. Not because humanity alone deserves this right, but because I believe every species in this alliance deserves the chance to protect itself without waiting for someone else's permission to survive. The chamber erupted into discussion the moment she stepped back from the podium, delegates turning to their neighbors, aides rushing back and forth with messages, the noise rising and falling in waves, as Speaker Orvan Thass called for order, again and again. The debate that followed lasted 11 hours, stretching late into the station's artificial night cycle, delegates arguing over every clause, every word, every implication of what Elena Voss had proposed. In the end, the amendment passed, though not by a wide margin, and not without concessions on both sides. Humanity agreed to cap the Sovereign Zone fleet at 500 capital ships without further council approval, agreed to submit quarterly reports to the new Oversight Commission, and agreed to open limited technology exchange programs that would allow other species to slowly modernize their own defenses over the coming decades. In exchange, the Concord formally recognized humanity's right to maintain its fleet, and for the first time in 200 years, humanity's delegation was granted a permanent seat on the Council's newly formed Security Committee, a body previously reserved only for the Concord's founding species. 6 months later, Admiral Marcus Cole stood on the observation deck of the Endeavour, watching through the great window as a small transport shuttle approached the shipyard, carrying the first rotation of the Concord Oversight Commission. Among the delegates aboard was a young Ythran scout, recently promoted from the Exploration Guild into a diplomatic role, still slightly nervous about his sudden and unexpected fame. Sael stepped off the shuttle and looked up at the shipyard with wide eyes, taking in the scale of it properly for the first time, no longer forced to guess at shapes through a haze of dust and passive sensors. "Quite a sight," Marcus said, walking over to greet him personally. "I never imagined I would come back here as a guest," Sael admitted. "Last time, I thought your defense ships were about to destroy my scout." Marcus smiled, the expression softening the tired lines of his face. "Last time, we didn't know if you were the first sign of an invasion, or just an unlucky explorer who wandered somewhere he shouldn't have. Times have changed, Sael. Come on, I'll show you around properly this time." They walked together through the shipyard's central corridor, past viewing windows that looked out onto the great construction arms, still busy, still building, though now under the watchful, curious eyes of a dozen different species rather than in complete secrecy. Sael noticed something as they walked, something he had not expected to see in a place built, at its heart, for war. There were engineers from 3 other species now working alongside human crews, brought in through the new technology exchange program, learning alongside humanity's own shipbuilders, contributing their own ideas to newer designs. It did not look like a fortress preparing for a fight. It looked, strangely, like something closer to a shared workshop, cautious but genuine, built between people who had spent 200 years too afraid of each other to try. "Admiral," Sael said eventually, "may I ask you something?" "Go ahead. Do you regret that I found this place? That the whole galaxy found out what you had built?" Marcus considered the question seriously before answering, watching through the viewport as another half-finished hull drifted slowly past, framed by distant stars. "No," he said finally. "I won't pretend those first few weeks weren't frightening. We came very close to a war that would have cost more lives than either of us wants to imagine. But secrets like this one, Sael, they can only protect you for so long, before the fear of being discovered becomes its own kind of danger. I think, in the end, we were always going to have this conversation with the galaxy eventually. I'm glad it happened the way it did, with words instead of weapons, even if it took both of those things sitting closer together than any of us were comfortable with to get there." He looked at Sael and offered a small, tired smile. "Humanity spent 200 years building a shield in the dark because we were too afraid to ask for anything else. Maybe now, finally, we get to find out what it looks like to build something in the light instead." Behind them, the shipyard continued its quiet work, ships taking shape, piece by piece, under 100 different hands, from a dozen different worlds, no longer hidden, no longer alone. And for the first time since Rhea's station burned 2 centuries before, humanity looked out at the galaxy not with fear, but with something closer, finally, to hope. The end.